Hello viewers, this is In Conversation with Trevor. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. My guest today is a climate change activist, an agricultural expert and a professor of rural development. His name is Prof Matondi and I'll be in conversation with him next. Prosper Matondi, my guest today. Let's begin, I suppose, by way of introduction with you very briefly telling us who you are and how you ended up doing the things that you do, that you're so passionate about.
Well, thank you, Farai. Or probably I should say the new Trevor in Conversation with Trevor. And I'm glad to be at this show to share with you various aspects of my life and also my work around rural development. That touches a number of areas, be it climate change, be it renewable energy, be it social protection, working with vulnerable communities, refugees, or even living with the refugees to understand them better in terms of their life. I've worked at a higher level with government, with private sector, and with the development partners in a range of issues that includes climate, agriculture, food security, and so on. But more importantly, I've also worked with young people. I've tried by all means to develop young people in terms of education, but also in terms of having them doing plowback in their communities where they come from. So you would see that the range of students that I've supervised or mentored range from those with no degrees at all to those with master's, PhD. I can't even count the number of PhD students that I've had now. Yeah, but it's an area that really does excite me to help young people in order to move the country forward and society forward. So those range of issues are something that probably we'll share in this session for the benefit of the viewers.
I want to start with something that is very topical at a global level and something that you have taken to social media about, you've been very vocal about, and that is the issue of climate change. Do you think as a nation we are taking this challenge seriously enough?
I think we have to be very historical in terms of our role and our engagement with the climate change. And probably Zimbabwe was probably one of the countries in the world to have taken climate change seriously. I go back to the 1980s, for instance, where we had the only university then, the University of Zimbabwe, having a climatology course that it ran for a number of years. I'm not sure whether the university is still doing that. But I think at a national level, we do. And in terms of policies, in terms of planning strategies, we do have a quite good engagement on that. The key matter that arises is in relation to the actual actions that we need to be undertaking. But actions comes not just with responsibility, but also comes with resources. Mm-hmm. The resources for climate change probably are not adequate for us to move headway in terms of what we can do better. But I think the message is out there. Government effort in the national climate policy, a climate strategy, a communication strategy, and all of that in place. But the question is, how is that being translated to real action to address climate-related issues? Because we do have a global responsibility, a shared responsibility. All of us, be it smallholder farmers, be it people in urban setups, and also at a global level. So you have those key markers at the global level that one needs to look at in terms of climate change and also our responsibility towards meeting that collective. And I think I always say to people, small is beautiful. We grew in that era of small is beautiful. But I'm beginning to say that we have got a shared responsibility for the larger global good. It has also to be beautiful, and we've got a shared responsibility to address climate change.
How do we fit in that a very small country in the global context? And I want to take you here to a debate that's always raging, where as developing nations we are being perhaps called on to sign up to treaties and declarations and conform to standards that are being set by already developed countries who perhaps did the same things that we want to do in order to get to where they are. Carbon emissions, for instance, not using coal and looking for cleaner energy. Where do we fit in, and is it fair for us to have to conform to those standards?
I think that's a very controversial and probably an issue that really touches all the soul of what we need to be doing, as developing countries and also as Zimbabwe, as part of that global collective. We are not being called upon to, but we have to be part of the agenda, somehow. To be part of the agenda means engaging with good science, with good knowledge, good information, and good data to be able to do so. So I don't think that we are being called not to develop our country, because in terms of carbon emission, everyone has got a responsibility. But some have got far greater responsibility than others. And for us, it's a question of how we mobilize our society and communities in be able to cut on carbon emissions. Let's just look at Zimbabwe, just Zimbabwe itself. In terms of its emissions, much of it comes from energy, and 50%, 49% comes from fossil fuels that we use for our energy and so on. But the second largest emitter is agriculture, with probably around 36%, if I'm correct. But you have got our industry, manufacturing, for instance. It just contributes about 5% to the Zimbabwean emissions, and West contributes about 6%. So we've got a situation where industry is actually a very low emitter. That means that there's probably much more leeway to move with it. When we look for alternatives, be it in terms of renewable energy and so forth, solar energy and other alternatives. There's a huge gap that we can fulfill. The question is, what is needed to be able to reorient our industry towards meeting the targets of not just of climate change, carbon reduction, but also of growing industry, so that we are able to, to provide goods and services to our population. I think that's where the crux of the matter is. And for us, there is a leeway for moving forward. But we also have to look at the global agreements. How do we socialize some of the global agreements around the United Nations framework for Convention on Climate Change, as well as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as well, in terms of for the science around it? How do we, get data, adequate data that we can use for informing policy and change? So those are fundamental issues, and we are in agreement with the global community. That's why Zimbabwe is a party to the UNFCCC Convention on Climate Change. But at the same time, we also participate in all the conference of parties. I can't remember from when, but the significant is the Paris Accord in 2015. We heavily participated in it, and we still do the other conference of parties as well, because we have that global responsibility for cutting on emissions, but also for changing people's livelihoods through interventions around adaptation and mitigation.
Translating our obligations at a global, at a national level, to actually then the grassroots. So taking it down to the community level to make sure that that smallholder farmer in that community, wherever it is in that rural community, is doing what they need to do, is aware that they also have to act.
Yeah, as part of our agricultural interventions, especially agriculture extension and to enhance agricultural productivity, mainstreaming climate change is quite fundamental. But you have to look at the whole gamut of problems related to to climate change that look especially in terms of agriculture production, food security, and how water management, soils management, and all of those factors of production that are key in our production system. We are different because our smallholder production is essentially based on rainfall. But the Lord has been very unkind. We've had more years of rainfall deficits than plenty. In the last decade, for instance, I would say that 2016 to 2017 was a good year, and also this current season, where we're expecting probably about 2.8 million tons of maize. That's a record breaking since 1980. We've gone to those big numbers, but the main factor is not because of any of the interventions we've made. It's simply because we've had a very good rainfall season. But let me tell you that in the next 5 years, 10 years, we might not have that rainfall. You look at the expectation according to the IPCC reports is that for Zimbabwe, we expect rainfall to decrease by about 4.1% by 2030. And within the scale of around 5.6% by 2070. So in other words, we are going to have more times when we have got rainfall deficit. But how do we prepare for that? How do we make society reorient towards that? Knowing very well that our irrigation is very, very low. We are talking about 275,000 hectares of irrigated land, And for the very first time this year, and in terms of our targets for wheat, we are probably around 200,000 that has been targeted. That's quite significant, but very small in in relation to our capacity, which can go all the way to about a million hectares under irrigation. So as long as we don't have control of water resources, there's no way we can fight better climate change and its effects on rural communities. And increasing the areas and the area under irrigation for smallholder farmers is fundamental. But that's a cost. It has got a huge cost that ordinary farmers cannot meet. So what do we do in terms of precise intervention that we need to deal with climate change at household level?
What do we do?
Yeah, one solution is Fumvudza. You've heard a lot about it. Well, Fumvudza, it's a very good program. It's not new. Let me give you a bit of historical context to it. Fumvudza program is good. It has been a natural program of food security within communities, are historical, right? But the greatest investment for Fumvudza, probably of its kind, was between 1926 and 1950, when we had a missionary called Emily Alvord, who designed the first Fumvudza type of production system for a variety of other political reasons around smallholder intensification. But we have also, it has got some religious or biblical foundations to it. We've got foundations of farming that has been promoting it in the current season. But when you look at the Fumvudza itself, it's good because it deals with source management, water resources management, but also tries to maximize the labor inputs by reducing the area under production and intensifying. That's a very good kind of intervention, because our raw problem is not much of our incapacity to produce. It's a labor question. We don't have adequate labor in our raw areas, in our smallholder farming areas, to produce on large areas. So you have to intensify on smallholder areas in order to be able to meet household food security, but having a surplus to market. So when you look at a Fumvudza plot, for instance, it's 39 by 16 meters. That's a very small area. It's about 0.06 hectares, and you are then expected to produce enough on that plot for your own household production and also surplus for sale. So they concentrated on maize, on sorghum, and other edible crops. So I would say that when you look at the figures, in terms of the total, you have to produce about 15 tons on those 0.6 hectares to be able to meet the targets. But it's impossible to do that. So that's where the figures play differently, because we have got guys with much more land, much more resources, being unable to produce 10 tons per hectare, right? So how do you then expect smallholders to do that? I think the figures, someone has to look at the figures in terms of whether they will be sufficient enough to be able to meet those targets. But I would say that Fumvudza itself, it's not a bad idea. It's a very good program. The question is, how can we sustain it in the next 5 years, or within the context of the Vision 2030 strategy?
What we've seen in recent weeks is mechanization,
Yes.
that is targeting specifically Fumvudza. Is that the right way to go? Because we're often told, we obviously need to be more efficient, and mechanization is the way to do that.
Yes, mechanization is very good to do. I've been campaigning probably for the last 5 years around ending the use of the hoe for farming. And when you look at the hoe, Badza, it's usually used by women, for majority who are actually the producers who work the land. And it's a spine-breaking tool that needs to be put into the museum. And if you argue that we need the hoe in the museum, you also have to start thinking about alternatives. What then do we do to be able to produce, probably at the same level or even higher level? That's where mechanization becomes then suitable. But look at we have got a mechanization policy that was designed about 10 years ago. Now it's coming to fruition. A number of players are coming in with different propositions and solutions and techno solutions. For instance, the unit that they are selling now, the two-wheel tractor, it goes for $6,000. Who can afford that? Yes, indeed. Who really can afford that? So it actually means that we need a different model in order for smallholders to be able to access those units. You might not want to have every smallholder farmer having a tractor. It's highly inefficient.
True.
Because you are not using it throughout the year. Just the same, you don't need a combined harvester as a single farmer. You don't need all those 370 horsepower tractors alone when you've got adequate land to produce on it. So what you need is to go for the alternatives. Do we come up with different sorts of companies, smallholder companies that really job is to manage the mechanization rather than them farming? So that when I need a tractor, I get it. When I need a combine harvester, I get it. So those are the things that we need to be talking about, because honestly speaking, the two tractors, they're just too way expensive.
Way expensive, out of reach. And I suppose that speaks to, the next point I wanted to bring in, where, which is tied to rural development, but also agricultural development. This reliance, or the fact that we are talking now about maize and grains. And so we've done fantastically well. But for the next 8 months or so, what is happening on that land, maximizing the utility of the land? Should we also be looking at alternative crops or other crops, or diversifying what we grow in order to ensure food security and economic upliftment?
Our trouble in Zimbabwe, and as most other countries, that we suffer from being maize-centric in our approach. And I would say that we have introduced another one, which is wheat-centric. In other words, during the season, the focus is actually likely on maize, even though now there's some configuration of small grains or traditional grains. But winter season, we are concentrating heavily on wheat, reintroduction or resuscitation of wheat production, which I earlier said is now almost targeted about 200,000 hectares, which is quite significant since 2000. But do we have any other crops that we could focus on? I think that's where we are. That's where we are lacking. And to be able to do so, one needs to look at food security and food diversity within the context of household needs. What else besides maize and the sorghum do they require? I think that's where we are lacking. But there's been a significant movement towards reviving horticulture production.
Sure.
Horticulture production in a small faceted way. But a key sector that probably we are not looking very carefully at, but which is also a huge agricultural and economic driver, is livestock. Livestock farming in all its facets. We haven't done enough for the livestock sector, because we have been maize-centric and we're now wheat-centric. How do you become livestock-centric? Because for agriculture to thrive, you need a better performing livestock sector. You need your protein and so on. But you look now at the opportunities in the livestock sector, they are quite limited. They need to be pushed. I'm happy that the government, through the Ministry of Lands, Agriculture, Water, Fisheries, and Rural Resettlement, has seen that opportunity by creating a department that is specific to fisheries. Remember, some 10 years or 5-6 years ago, we had a livestock command program that included fisheries and wildlife. But now they've created a department specifically for fisheries, which is actually a positive move. But what is it that we can do more around livestock? Livestock is a key question, especially also in view for climate change and so on. That really does matter, because most of the young people who want to go farming, they are looking to go into horticulture, because they are excited by seeing persons like myself doing it on my small plot, right? But also going to different markets where horticulture produce is produced, and I think it's as easy as ABC, but it's not. There are key challenges that one faces from season to season, from time to time. It's not just a question of resources, but it's also a question around extension, skills, and being able to read the market better and be able to intervene. So for me, that's fundamental.
We'll come back to some of those challenges and opportunities, but I want to zero in on this livestock that you've just mentioned. What is it that can be done? Because again, it comes back to cost. You've got beasts. They need to be vaccinated. They need to be dipped and all these things. And we have seen challenges in that sphere as well going forward. January disease has been a huge, there's been a lot of devastation in that regard. So how do we come up with models that are within reach, that are sustainable, and that will work for our communities? What are they?
The greatest challenge is that in livestock, we have tended to as a country, we have tended to give it the responsibility for management to government, right? So government manages deep tanks, right? Deep tanks were constructed by government. Deep tanks were run by government. Water for deep tanks was done by government. Everything, even the institutional running of a deep tank with a deep tank committee was run by government. Everything was government. But no one thought that we will reach a time when government can withdraw and say, oh, well, it's not our responsibility to run it. It's your cattle. Just go dip your cattle. Find your dipping for chemicals. Run that as a community. And I think government is not wrong to be able to say that, because at the end, when you lose a beast, the loss is felt more at household level, right? Mm-hmm. You use your livestock to meet your social needs, but also your economic needs and emergency needs. So it becomes a storehouse of value, a storehouse of resources for your family. So when you lose them, you lose 16 to 20. It's not government that is lost, it's the individual farmer. So it then becomes incumbent upon the individual farmer to come up with formula to protect their asset, the way you would protect your house, your car, and so forth. It's your responsibility.
Why isn't that appreciation there?
Because, as I said,
it's always been government.
It tended to have been government. They would see a deep tank there, wasted within the same community, but they have been waiting for government for 5-10 years to come and deal with it. But government has tried to come back to help them, but it won't completely be able to take responsibility for people's cattle. Okay, let's say you have Farai, you have got 10, you're 10 cattle. You know that the country, you've got a particular disease that is. What do? You have to care. You have to sell one in order to save 10, to save 9, right? That makes economic sense, because now when you're looking at an average livestock or average cattle, the price is around $300 to $400, right? Mm-hmm. That you get. Mm-hmm. And if you, instead of using that with the whole 10 and its total value, you have used $300 or even less, or $100 in order to be able to save 9. But at the same time, by saving so, you have also enough money to be able to enjoy yourself, to be able to send your children to school, to meet your life responsibilities.
And the cost, I remember speaking to some farmers in the Masvingo area, devastated by January disease, who are saying now certain traditional processes cannot happen or are severely hampered. You can't, for instance, when someone dies, you can't traditionally you can't kill a beast because you don't have any more. Marriages, you want to send over some cattle for Luola. Those animals aren't there anymore.
A couple of weeks ago, the first head count of livestock was released. And we have been worried for some time that we had maintained the same figure since 2000. But apparently, from the last head count, there is an increase actually in cattle across all, and livestock across all types of livestock, which is quite significant. The question is, what does this growth mean, right? Before we go into the specific household, usage of livestock to meet different needs. So I would say that we need to be clear on data to be able to understand the sector better and how it is evolving. You look at the goats, you look at pigs. They've actually grown in numbers. The question is around the distribution. Where growth has happened and has not happened. So those are the things that we need to be dealing with. Mm-hmm. Then we go, of course, to the household level, that they are not able to kill or to kill any of their livestock because the numbers are very little at household level, and that's understandable, because livestock traditionally has been not just a livelihood or storehouse of nature, but also used for a multi-variety of social-cultural needs. And that's understandable when farmers hold on to their livestock. But holding on in a situation where January disease is decimating livestock does not make good sense. So they need to be able to dispose on time, but not to dispose onto the market where you, Farai, you go into a butchery, you are not pretty certain of the meat that you're going to buy. And you're worried that probably meat with disease like January disease is being sold in the markets. Who knows? Probably it's happening. And hard as in the last 2 years, that has been a problem. But we've got a very good institutional framework to dealing with livestock matters. Look at foot and mouth. Mm-hmm. We've got specific zones that are designated as high prone to foot and mouth. Yeah. And the country, the ministry and department is able to quarantine certain areas when there's an outbreak very well. But its management of January disease could be better if we actually start by where we, from the framing around the foot and mouth, then we go to other diseases and so forth. Mm-hmm. So those things can actually be done.
Mm-hmm. Earlier, you spoke about horticulture and the big attraction for many young people to go into it because they see, these stories of take your tomatoes to Mbari Msika and you'll come back with loads and loads of money, pack your cabbages on a truck and go and sell them on the side of the road and you'll get loads and loads of money.
Yeah.
Is that the reality? Because I know in your other life, apart from being an academic, you spend quite a lot of time with the vendors and the traders at Mbari Msika.
Yes. Yes, so that's something that really I'm very passionate about, production of food. But, the main incentive for me at first was I wanted to eat good food. I was tired of going into these retail shops, getting vegetables, fruits, all imported from outside the country. Then I said, why should I be eating spinach that comes from South Africa? Why should I be eating a carrot from South Africa? Then I decided to do my own production, just for my own and family consumption. And when I started doing that, I then reflected to say, but everyone else can also do the same. So why can't they produce good food? But then a huge hype or a huge movement started around farming brings wealth, quick wealth. I have no doubt about that. But the question is, that wealth is predicated on actual hard work, resources, financing, planning, and all of that. And many of the young people then started going into the sector. Some will say, okay, I want to do 20,000 cabbages because a cabbage is $1. So potentially you're going to get 20,000 US within 4 or 5 months of production. There's nothing like that. It will never happen. You've got the young person saying that, I'm going to do a hectare of tomatoes. But look at our markets and how our markets function. It's a very complex market system. Today it does very well, tomorrow it's down. So you get your tomatoes going for about $18 at the beginning of the year. Now that sandak, or whatever it is that you use for measurement, is now $2 to $5. So you've gone from $18 to nothing, but you have produced tomatoes or cabbages with this high expectation, and the market fails you. So the damage is much more than at individual level. It damages, the agricultural sector itself, because we are not planning better. We are not producing what the market requires, because you've got this glut of where you have got zero production of particular commodity lines, but overproduction at other times. Everyone moves into cabbages, or moves into tomatoes, or moves into broilers, or moves into this, because of the hype, without really planning and thinking through your production system and your capacities. So that's a key problem.
Whose responsibility is this to sort of manage that flow of information to ensure that we don't have these gluts and shortages in some areas? So there's better distribution.
Yeah, now there's no one who takes that responsibility, because if farmer organizations were as strong as they used to be, they ordinarily will be playing that role of coordinating data and information, as well as price regimes across the different markets in the country. But our farmer unions are not capacitated to that level to play that role. The private sector also tried to do the same through various agencies such as AIM, Cambo, and so forth, in order to provide market information. Even ZFU itself, Zimbabwe Farmers Union, they had a very strong marketing department that used to play that role and give regular or weekly patterns of prices and so forth. So the responsibility lies with such institutions to play that role. I will not even put government into perspective, only with respect that government is driving the government agenda, and has got a potential to also provide matching infrastructure for information sharing and so forth. But so long it's not yet there and up and running, then it's just open. Farmers are depending on themselves, for sharing market information by phone. Or by now WhatsApp groups and all of those things that are apparently seem to be working, but not adequately. So as I said earlier on, we have an overflood of tomatoes right now in the market at Mbari Msika. But we have got places like Vic Falls and Kariba that are importing tomatoes, the same tomatoes, right? And the farmers are losing here. So the problem is on the market information and infrastructure that is not coherent enough to be able to send signals or where good products are needed, and on what time, and all of those things. That really needs to be worked on. That's an open opportunity. And I would say that if the private sector can come on board to help, smallholder farmers and consumers as well, that would be very, very vital. you know, and they'll be able to make money for themselves as well. I've sitted at the maize-centric market last year for about 6 months, and I now know the dynamics better of how that market's operating and what needs to be done. We are not doing enough.
What we often hear is, in those markets there are, for lack of a better term, cartels, but leaders who, middlemen who manipulate the system. Is that real? How are the workings behind the scenes?
They are called makoronyera in our lingo when we are trading at Mbari, right? And people have got probably a very strong negative attitude towards them, thinking that they are the ones that are making money. They are not. To be true, I say they are not because the market is open to anyone. The farmers are producing. They don't want to spend a single 3-hour, 4-hour per day at Mbarimsika. They want to come, dispose and leave because their job, their mandate is to produce for the market. But now they are being forced to stay at the market because of the market dynamics, right? But now, when we do our trade nights, because I participate in trade nights at Mbari, when you're there at Mbarimsika, right, around 10 a.m. or 11 p.m. Throughout the night, farmers, they come from midnight until 5 in the morning. That's where they come. And they want to dispose and leave. But most often they can't dispose because of, there's just too many of them at the same time. So they actually hire makoronyera to help them to dispose what they would have brought. Right? So you have to look at it as a factor of demand for a service by the farmers, right? Then if you see makoronyera in that way, then it's different. But of course, there is what could be cartels across different commodities. Like you have got one guy who is responsible for setting the onion price at Mbari, or tomatoes, or beetroot, or this. You have got those individuals, but I don't think that they are the significant factor and matter in the whole marketing system. They don't, right? So you need your middle person to play a role, and a middle person that can provide that service for the farmers better, and provide services also to the clients, the consumers. That would actually be a win-win situation for everyone. So these partnerships are actually needed, and for now, we need the middle person to play that particular role for the farmers to be able to benefit. Yeah. So they don't get much out of it. To be honest, myself, I work with about 4 or 5 young people. What we share per day at the end of our market day is very, very little. They get $5-10 each per day and so forth. It's not much to be able to condemn them to say that the middle persons are bad. But you see, there is the market defined middle person that probably can play a better role. For instance, I'll be able to master resources to go and do a outgrower kind of contract. I want onions or I want carrots. I mobilize resources and go to the farmer and said, can you put 2 hectares of carrot? Here are the inputs, and here's a consultant to help you to produce that for the market. Once it's ready, I'll come and harvest and put it on the market in Mbari or throughout the country where it's needed. So that's a very good middle person who's playing a very positive change role that potentially benefits the farmer because you are guaranteeing them a market. Right? You are guaranteeing them an income. You are not wasting their time to be able to go back into production because horticulture is different from maize, is different from all the summer crops, is different from livestock. You need to be there 24 hours, and so forth. So farmers don't want to waste a lot of time. So developing that kind of relationship and partnership is fundamental in this kind of market.
What we're often told, and I think the solution that often people say, you're saying that the market is flooded with tomatoes now, and I'm sure quite a significant number will go to waste, unfortunately. And we often hear people saying, why don't we just value add, can those tomatoes and all that? How easy is that? I mean, how practical are those sort of solutions that people mention, or are they far removed from what people are actually facing on the ground and the realities that make them unable to pursue such avenues?
The trouble is that we start thinking about value addition the moment there are losses, like we're experiencing in Mbari. That means it's a knee-jerk reaction. It's ad hoc. We have not planned for canning. We have not planned for manufacturing of the tomatoes, even before they are there in the market. So we have to go back to our planning systems, and also when you do your planning, you also have to start thinking about an investment plan for that in terms of canning. I would say that if we do have forward, we have to be very creative. There's now one factory that is doing canning in Mutoko. And we were traditional canners, right? Like the companies that used to do that. We would think of Canes, for instance. It had a canning plant for tomato paste in Mtaria, and also one in Harare. There's Chegutu Canners. There was another canning factory in Norton. The question is, are they still operating the way they used to operate? I doubt very much, which is the reason why they can't absorb all these tomatoes. But also, the variety that is used for canning is different from the open varieties that we buy every day. You have to have your good agronomist advising on the specific varieties that are suitable for canning, right? So the gem variety, for instance, are the best for canning. But the amount of gem tomatoes that are on the market, when you look at it right now, there isn't much compared to the conventional tomatoes that we consume on a day-to-day basis. So that's what we need to think about. The second point is around the market distribution. Where is your demand? Where are you doing the trade? You can put the factory at the source of production, but you can put the factory at the source of the market, closer to the consumers. But that requires a lot of strategic thinking, resources, and investment into it. Large companies tried it, international and local companies tried it in the past. What will convince you now that a smallholder farmer is able to drive that agenda around creating these factories? They are not interested. They're interested in producing for the market. So the young people that are now driving the agenda of Zimbabwe agriculture is rising, have got that responsibility to think beyond just going to farm. They have to think above the value chains, to say, what can we do as young people to be able to go into manufacturing, into value addition, into all those sorts of things. We don't all need to be wearing overalls. Someone has to be, to be wearing
smarter,
smarter in the agricultural value chain before we even go to the retail markets, be it in the formal and informal. So there is a huge opportunity that has not been explored, but someone has to catalyze that. What is it that we can do to catalyze that? Government alone can't do it. We've got funds from development partners, for instance. We had funds from the private sector. Private sector also has to play a role, because at the end, these are the guys who are going to benefit most from these value chains. So that needs to be looked at, and necessary investments are put in place.
So what you're talking about requires resources, requires investment, finance, and all these other things. That brings me then to the next big issue that is often talked about in our agriculture, and that is access to finance and the challenges around that. We've just seen AFC being rebirthed or coming back to life. Is that the right way?
Oh, well, anything that brings money to the smallholder farmer is the right way, right? And we know that farmers in our current context have really struggled to master resources for farming. And in any form of agriculture worldwide receive some sort of subsidies, right? And it's not new. It's old as as it is. So I would say that the rebranding of Agribank, is it Agribank, into AFC was an expectation. But the key argument then over the years was that we needed a land bank, land and property. I would have added land and property bank in order to be able to mobilize resources that is very specific to agriculture, but also plays a role in infrastructure development and semi-industrialization based on our agricultural comparative advantage. That I would argue for that. So my hope is that the AFC is reconstituted. It's not just a nostalgia of the 1980s, 1990s, but it also reflects where we want to go as a country in terms of the change parameters around financing, commercial financing and private financing for smallholder farmers. Yes, Command Agriculture works a lot. It's not just in the name command, but it's what that money does to smallholder farmers. So if you have got 800 to 1 million households getting access to those resources, of which they have since the 1980s, then it's necessary in order to cushion against extreme food insecurity. So that's a necessary kind of investment. But also then you have got your commercial sector that requires resources. We know that because of the history of Zimbabwe itself and the key contending issues around the land reform program, not much resources has gone into the commercial farming sector, which I will now say stands as state land, because there's contest around it. So resources have not been going, except government resources. But they've been, fortunately, for over the years, there have been ways in which they've juggled that market in terms of financing. You go to mainstream commodities, for instance, tobacco. Tobacco has grown phenomenally since 2000, right? To surpass the largest production in the 1990s, and that's very positive. So the commodity, when you have it, when you consume your tobacco, I hope you don't smoke, but if you do, we are promoting this sector. I would say that when you do commodity-specific analysis, you then say that, okay, finance already is going into both the smallholder commercial farming sector and the previous, areas as well that are still contested, because it's really a market demand supply mechanism that is working, and financial institutions then saw just an opportunity to go into contracting, or participating in the auction system. So that's working perfectly. The question is, how do you translate that model into other commodities, right? Except those that are under state control or national state security, like your maize, right? So other commodities, how can they benefit? That model has not worked. I look at soybean value chain, for instance. There's insurmountable opportunity in this environment. We've got a couple of processors that are waiting for the commodity, right? Our capacity to process, soybean is around 440,000 tons per year. But our production figures have been hovering around less than 100,000 tons, or probably a little bit more now. But that little bit more now is not able to meet the demands of the processors. So they literally have to import the soybean for processing, for you to be able to have your oil and so forth. So that's a huge opportunity. But you then look at the cost parameters. The price that GMB pays for maize is higher than what it pays for soybean per ton. That's a contradiction, right? It might look like a contradiction. But what this means is that what is it that the market needs to do to be able, especially the players in the sector, to be able to induce better prices for the farmers to be able to go into soybean production? You ask me today, next year, if you want to go into production, I would say, if the prices are maintained the way they are, I'm more attracted to go into maize than into soybean.
Are those sustainable prices, though?
But you see, this is a state commodity that you require for your food security, and that requires the state to stabilize it. It's a common world.
So it's
common
necessary,
world.
yes.
The question is, yes, the government through the GMB and the state agencies can sustain that particular prices because they've got a particular political interest around maize production and its stabilization, right? But they will not bother around soybean production and other commodities. The question is, given the capacity and demand that is there for soybean, what is it that the private sector can work out in terms of private sector packages, for the production of soybean, and having the private-public partnerships or PPPs is also essential for that. A couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to some guys at Olive in Industry, and they were saying that, they want to go into massive contracting for soybean production. I guess, large companies like Cairns would be saying that, National Foods, and a whole range of these companies, they need the commodities, for not just for food consumption, but also for the livestock sector. You need a soy cake and so forth. The demand is high. Once your value of your livestock is put at a premium, and the demand for protein in this country is extremely very high, but we are not able to satisfy it. I'll tell you, the egg. Let's just look at poultry, for instance. We produce probably a very minute amount of eggs for the consumption of this country, and the rate amount of consumption of eggs is probably one of the lowest in the whole world, in fact. So you look at your rural areas, the demand for eggs, how many times do people eat eggs in rural areas? Rarely.
Really? Yeah.
How many times the chicken, of course you can push road runners, but probably the economics won't work because they said, I will just have our road runner for this week or after 2 weeks. It doesn't matter, right? So, but that represents to you an unfulfilled market. So what you only need to do is to go to change the culture around the consumption of protein-based food, livestock meat.
Does that not speak to that consumption pattern? Does that not speak to issues of poverty? And are we able to do all these things that we've been speaking about? Because all these things require that we come out of poverty and people have more money in their pockets.
You know, I always point out that we've got a material poverty, but we don't have a poverty of ideas and knowledge, right? We do have answers to all those questions. The question is, why is it that we are not doing the right things, right? And that requires specific answers to address what I call extreme poverty. Okay, now let me turn this around a little bit. You have got your Vision 2030 around wanting to be a middle-income country by 2030, right?
Yes.
And it's part of your vision. It's also part of the National Development Strategy 1, right? For the 5-year National Development Strategy. But the strategy might not work because the main incumbent to its working is around its precise objectives of being a middle income. But one of the key objectives it needs to add is around ending extreme hunger. Extreme hunger is what faces society, right? So you cannot move a vision around a middle income alone without addressing extreme poverty. As long as families are going to bed hungry or having one meal a day, probably this might not happen, but who knows in the future years to come. So you are not going to achieve that key objective. So you need specific parameters around injecting or catalyzing rural development that addresses poverty issues, right, and so forth. But for quite some time now, whilst the state has got the whole institutional framework for dealing with poverty-related issues and development, we have got development partners who have camped into Zimbabwe for the last 20, 30 years, right, working in rural areas, right, and claiming, as they do, that they're actually creating a change to end poverty. But then we look at the poverty figures from the 1990s up to now. We are getting worse.
Higher.
They're getting worse, deeper. Well, not higher, deeper, deeper into poverty. Is it that their models are not working? What is it that is not working? When they are saying that we've pushed in millions of dollars into those rural communities, that really bothers me and worries me. Because for me, it has to do with the approach, the strategies, and how those strategies don't result in addressing poverty, but it results in the presence of development actors perpetually in these areas. Without mentioning some of the programs, I would say there are different kinds of programs. Climate resilience, right? Or climate resilience, or community adaptation, or this and that. So you've got very different funding portfolios. Last year, through the Global Climate Fund, $26.2 million US dollars was provided to the Southern Low Belt for addressing climate-related poverty and to address livelihood challenges in those regions. And government was expected to match with about $40 million US dollars to that particular fund. And there were other funds that were mobilized around it. The question is, when I went to the Low Belt at the beginning of this year, for our assessment, I said, but where is this 26 million going to?
Indeed.
Right. I have to be shown. Show me where it is going.
And were you shown?
I was not shown. Yes, I was not shown. I spent probably 3 weeks in the region doing an assessment of the progress around some of the development funding, issues to do with child rights, issues to do with women, issues to do with agriculture, and to look at the state of agriculture, and to probe some of the key indicators that they use. And unfortunately, I could not see that. Someone has to give an explanation. This is a 7-year program. Probably this is the second year. We need to have a scorecard around it in terms of its performance. It will be shared wide in public so that at least people know where it's going. So you've got these funding portfolios right across. But when you look at how they are structured, most of them, they go into communal areas, right, to address poverty in communal areas, right? And addressing poverty in communal areas is different from developing a commercial agriculture that is functional and helpful to economic growth, that should focus on everybody and every particular sector. So we have got a congestion of funding in about 26 districts, right, Out of a total, how many districts do we have in this country? Probably 70, 70 or 70 something districts. So you've got a concentration on 26 districts that still face extreme poverty, extreme hunger, where you need emergency funding
Every year,
every
perpetually,
other,
as you
perpetually.
say.
So, and where you're saying that you're pushing millions. So I can't see the balance. There is a mismatch.
Somewhere.
Somewhere.
There's greater scrutiny that's required
Yes,
there.
and they need to tell us what's going on with their, they love indicators. They love theories of change. They love all these big sounding words and so forth. But see, they use that for raising funds. The question
But
is...
I was going to say they also like big cars. And
Oh, of course, yes. The 4x4, they love 4x4s, to go out there and so forth. When you look at at their conditions for giving funding, visibility matters to them. Visibility of themselves. They want visibility on the cars, visibility on a very small, irrigation scheme, solar irrigation scheme, one there, a school there, a nutrition garden there, and so forth. But you're talking about millions of dollars. I will tell you what I've done. You've seen what I've done in my rural areas. I said, let me test some of these theories on rural development by being practical. Probably I'm too naive not to see that there's change. So what I did in my village, I transformed my rural area, used just a couple of $1,000, put a solar, 20,000 liters of water that is accessed by the whole village for the first time since 1940. And they used to think that it's only the role of government. But I put this in, I said, I'll get the water for it. It's for free. It's for free. I fenced 2 hectares of land. I've got youth that come and work the land. My parents are very old. But I said, okay, they're youth around who are doing nothing. Can they actually start working and making an income for themselves from that? That model does not cost you millions of dollars. It's just a couple of $1,000. And you're then able to get to get there. The question is, if I have got 100 of those, right? Or if you have got 5 in each district,
the impact
one
will be
in each ward, the transformation will be really huge and fundamental. But these resources that our colleagues have, probably, I don't know what they're doing with their money. They have to tell us.
Indeed.
Yes.
Very interesting there.
To run away from what you call phantom programming.
As we wrap up this discussion, I think the point you just raised also takes me back to the things we've spoken about earlier, things of market access, things of programming around climate and all that. How much of all that we're doing here in Zimbabwe that we've spoken about, and as a nation, is informed by research? Because I think research should inform all decisions. Are we adequately invested in research?
I'm very hard with our colleagues in higher education and research, simply because they are not playing the role that they are expected to play. We used to have a very good research, and development institutional framework in the country that goes well back to the colonial period. Like the improvement of maize, for instance. Probably Zimbabwe was in the forefront of the development of improved maize seed, hybrid seed. The SR 52, if you remember, Southern Rhodesia 1952. That is what it meant. So they did very well, probably across a range of commodities, competing with the US in terms of output per unit, right? In terms of production during that time. So that really sets the framework, for a good, robust research and development frame that could potentially help the farmers. But for that period, it was aimed at helping the large commercial farmers, who were largely white commercial farmers. So it took them probably 50 years to be able to be really good commercial farmers. But they were underpinned by a land bank that was created, I think, if not 1906, 1912, they had a newsletter, the farmer newsletter. They had a very robust extension system that ended up being a private extension system as consultants, right? Whilst we are still hanging on to free agricultural, they were actually hiring their own. They were protected by the law. If you look at the period 1925 to 1931, when they did the Land Apportionment Act, they then followed up that in 1934 with the Maize Control Act. In other words, the smallholder production without support, that support was able to surpass the production by the commercial farmers. And the commercial, the government had to put in legislation to put import parity price for maize production for the benefit of commercial farmers, not of smallholder farmers. So our potential was already there, right? So the question is, why is it that there's no continuous research and development? Look at our research stations throughout the country, right? They're dotted throughout the country. Yeah. Some have become redundant, some are still operating. They need funding, and they look for funding, not from anywhere else, but they're looking at from government without the capacity to be able to do so, because independently, the private sector and farmers should ideally be funding those research institutions, because it's in their interest to have good and sound research for their own production. There are a few companies, seed houses, that are investing in research, but also trying to promote a different kind of extension system, a motivating system for farmers to be able to produce their line of commodities. That's very positive. Look at Citco, Pana, and so forth. They are doing that. But the key disconnect that I see is around our universities. They are not playing that. The role of the university is to research and teach. To teach and research. But the research component does not receive adequate funding. So you've got innovation hubs that are created at all these universities. And my greatest criticism is that the innovation hubs must not be within universities. They must be within societies of practice where production is taking place, right? So we need more of those innovation hubs designed there at less cost than what it is currently. So you put up a good building, a good field station, and so forth. That high level up, but on the ground, the connection to the producer is not there.
Is the private sector not stepping up as they ought to, as you think they should, because they don't see any value in it?
They see value in the research, but they don't want to commit themselves to it by funding it. They expect probably the development partners and government to be funding it, while they sit back to say that, oh, by the way, we are actually producing for you, right? Instead, they need to see business opportunities and research and development and fund fund that, and also not just the private sector in terms of processing, right across the value chain, from aggregation, processing, manufacturing, value addition, and all those things. They need to put a component around research and development, for their own benefit.
Prosper Matondi, we're almost out of time, and before we go, I must ask you if you have any book recommendations for our viewers.
Okay, for the books, I would say that
apart from your own, the ones that you've written.
I was going to jump on my own books because I want to encourage people to read my books. But I read academic books more often, and my best, author, fan is James Scott, who wrote his book, Weapons of the Weak, in 1985, and there have been books around that kind of literature that I do read. A variety of books around people's struggles for development and so forth. I read some of those books, but texts around agriculture, rural development. I'm a fan of local authors. The Professor Rukuni, for instance, the late Samuel. The books that they wrote around agrarian studies and so forth are very popular books that I do like. And of course, I would not stop from saying that my books are also a good read if you try them. I've got a couple of books around, that are really...
The titles?
Yeah. I wrote several ones, but the prominent ones, I would say, the Biofuels, Land Grab and Food Security in Africa is a very good text to understand, the global land rush and also investments around that and the controversies around it. The Fast Track Land Reform Program in Zimbabwe, I wrote a book around that. Probably the only text besides the other texts written by Professor Ian Schools and others that are also out there in the market. I would say that those are some of the books that I spend my time reading. But some of my work is around the philosophy of life, of human life. I run the Human Universe series on social media, for instance. Every 7 days, you see something that I write about life. About relationships, social relationships, around giving confidence and energy to the future. So those kind of books and reads are some of the things that I do on my spare time.
Thank you so much for an insightful discussion, very engaging and very radical and thought-provoking insights.
Yes, thanks a lot, Farai. You're most welcome. I really enjoyed your show, and probably the listeners are going to benefit more from this engagement, this controversial engagement.
That does it for this edition of In Conversation with Trevor. My name is Farai Mwakutuya. I do thank you for tuning in and for choosing us. Be sure to join us again next time for another edition of the program.